in 1991, something dramatic happened in India, as I'm sure all of you know, and I'm talking about India's liberalization, as we call it, and the introduction of the deregulated and liberalized new economic framework that was, announced under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's government by then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh. So these reforms were actually India's hand was forced to do those reforms because India was on the brink of a balance of payments crisis, which simply put means that we did not have enough foreign exchange to service our debt obligations in foreign exchange. So we were on the brink of a BOP crisis, as we called it, arguably and definitely in my view, I'll say it quite unhesitatingly, due to some very, very poor decades of policy by Indian governments, by successive Indian governments. So that forced the Narasimha Rao government under Manmohan Singh's stewardship as a finance minister to push for very sweeping reforms, because that was one of the conditions that the IMF imposed, that India should embrace reforms on the economic side. And so that marked the beginning of what we now refer to as a new India, where foreign investment was allowed. Actually, prior to that liberalization, even private investment by domestic parties was very highly regulated, because it was not just about foreign investment, even domestic private sector was very heavily regulated. So one of the things that the Narasimha Rao government introduced was not just allowing FDI, but also deregulation, as we called it. Deregulation meant that the government said that most of the sectors would now be allowed for private sector, other than very, very few sectors. And since then, since that pivotal moment in 91, successive Indian governments, irrespective of the party in power, have fortunately had the good sense, in my view, to not backtrack on the reforms, and they have continued on this path. The exchange control has remained. It's not gone away. FERA was replaced in 1999 with a legislation called the FEMA, which all of you practicing lawyers will be at least familiar with, and also business people, because you deal with FEMA day in and day out. So the FEMA was what replaced the FERA, and the government's logic in completely replacing the old law and in renaming it as Foreign Exchange Management Act was to convey the message that the new India was going to have exchange control, no doubt, but it would be a much softer management version of the exchange control as opposed to the regulation part of it. So a big part of that was FDI was permitted in several sectors, but it was permitted with a lot of restrictions in those days, and fewer sectors were permitted. And I must say, to the credit of every successive government, including during times of some instability, the good part is that none of the governments, irrespective of who was in power, saw it fit to derail the reform process. So arguably, at some phases, the reform process could have stalled and become completely paralyzed. But even then, even in those times, even in those challenging times, fortunately, there was no regression or pushing back of the policy reform with respect to FDI and on exchange control.